Hi everybody and welcome back to Exotics of the World TV. Now in this episode we are going to be diving into the sandy little world of one of the most fascinating reptiles there is out there, and that is the Sand Fish Skink. These guys are unique, adorable, and absolutely jam-packed full of personality. But anyway, let's get into the video. And as always, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the content. So as always, let's talk about this animal's wild habitat and its natural geographical range. This will help us underpin and get a really decent idea on how we can care for these in captivity. Sandfish skinks are native to the arid deserts of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. These guys are not just at home in sandy environments, they absolutely thrive in them. These guys thrive in sandy, dry, arid kind of regions where the temperatures get super hot in the day and they drop very cool on a night time. Their natural habitat is full of really fine grained sand that allows them to burrow and swim. This swimming type behavior in the sand is fairly unique to this species. So if you have a closer look at a sandfish skink, you'll notice that they're very slender, and you'll also see that their appendages are kind of like splayed, so it gives the illusion that they're going through the sand and basically swimming. This behavior not only helps them to get away from predators, but it also helps them to thermoregulate. These little skinks are perfectly adapted for extreme environments. So now we've got the fundamentals in place. I'm hoping I'm painting a really nice picture in your brains of what these kind of areas are going to look like. So let's talk about the size of the enclosure that's recommended for housing these animals. So the bare minimum size that we would typically recommend housing a sandfish skink in is a 36 by 18 by 18 or a 90 by 45 by 45. If you have a look at a lot of old outdated kind of care guides and stuff for them, you'll notice that they'll recommend having them in like 20-gallon enclosures. These guys do shift a bit, so they're going to need a fairly decent amount of space. Now, even though we recommend a 3-foot enclosure as a bare minimum, if you want to go bigger, do so. As always, they will utilize the space, and especially with them being a very active species, they're going to benefit from it. Now, when it comes to cohabitation, this is fairly difficult. So there's not really that much on when it comes to cohabit. There's a few like papers and stuff and a few little care guides and stuff out there that say yes you can do or no you can't. What we would always say is look at the animal's natural history. Do they interact in the wild? Kind of ish. They do ish. Now this is also going to depend on your level as a keeper. If you're just starting out and you've just got into reptile keeping and you feel that the sandfish skink is the perfect little animal for you, then I would probably just have the one. However, if you feel that you're fairly experienced and you know what signs to look out for, you've kept with the reptiles in the past, then go ahead, you can trial it. But if you are a novice and you're just starting out, I would still recommend just keeping the one. If, however, you do decide to go for more than one, just make sure that the animals have got enough space. So enough like resources. So that can be like food bowls. It could be mealworm dishes. Just place extra in there so there's no resource guarding. Also place extra hides, rocks, decor, that type of thing. But we'll cover that later. Now, doing my research into these animals when it comes to UVB, and also brushing out my old like textbooks and stuff like that from when I used to keep them years ago, the UVB provision that we used to offer these animals was either non-existent or it was quite sadly lacking. So I think the highest level of UV that I saw was giving them an Exoterra 5.0 bulb, which I think equates to like a mid-range Ferguson Zone 2, which is quite bizarre thinking that these animals come from a range where the UVI is going to be fairly high. So you're looking at a minimum of like a Ferguson Zone 3. That's like a bare minimum. However, there is a caveat to this. So this is all going to depend on the height of the enclosure and how far away the animal is from the bulb. So always have a look at how far away the animal is going to be, and also have a look at the back of your bulb. On the backs of your bulbs, you should be able to see like a little Ferguson Zone chart. Well, a lot of people say that these animals don't necessarily need UVB because they're under the sand quite a lot. But they're also not. They have evolved to utilize the sun and to utilize the vitamin D that they get from the sun. So just to round this kind of confusing topic up, check your bulbs, make sure you've got the correct Ferguson zone, which we would say Ferguson zone 3, and always check the distance from the bulb to your animal. So moving on to basking spots now. So we would recommend this species have a hot spot, so right under the basking spot. We'd recommend that be a minimum of around about 35. Now you could go all the way up to about 40 with this species. This is absolutely fine to do so. They will tolerate it, but just make sure that they've got a lot of places to hide. Now you can do this by building up like a basking platform like we have done in with our Sand Fish Skinks, and also providing them a nice thick substrate. Now the warm side of the enclosure, you want this in the high 20s. So we would say a nice little range would be from like 29 to 25. And then on the cooler end of the enclosure, you're going to want this around about 24 to 20 degrees, there or thereabouts. This is in the daytime. So on a nighttime, everything turns off, and you should allow that to drop quite nicely. Even if you're getting low temperatures such as like 15 degrees, 10 degrees, that's absolutely fine. It gets quite cold in the desert on a nighttime. When it comes to monitoring your temperatures as well, we would always recommend using a digital thermometer. Now, these are going to be far more accurate than the old style dial thermometers, so definitely get some of those. Now, when it comes to digital thermometers, the cheaper you go, the worse it's going to be. I think a nice middle of the range is round about a tenner, there or thereabouts. Right then, so moving on to humidity. Now, with these guys coming from very, very hot and arid regions, the humidity is not going to be super, super high. So anywhere between like 20 to 40 is absolutely fine. If you find yourself that you're on the coast, your humidity is naturally going to be a little bit higher, but it's nothing really to worry about. As long as it's not going over into like the 60s, 70s and 80s, then you'll be absolutely fine. Also, the hotness of the enclosure is going to help dry the moisture out of the atmosphere. Now, even though these animals do come from harsh, arid environments with very low humidity, we would still always recommend at least offering one humid refuge. Now, if the animal wants to seek that humid refuge out, it can do so. So humidity is going to play a vital part in the animal when it comes to shedding, and also hydration. So you're not going to want the full enclosure being super, super humid. You can just have like a little cave or something buried underneath the substrate that the animal can easily access that's going to maintain the humidity. Now, you can achieve this by using cocoa fibers and sphagnum mosses and just checking on them every couple of days or so just to make sure that they've not dried out. So just to round off, nice humid hide, quite dry in the actual enclosure. Now, so my favorite part is substrate. So I know it's quite sad at this point, but I love a good sub. I love a good substrate. So what substrate to use? There are tons and tons and tons out there that you can use. Now, because these animals prefer like more finer kind of like sand, we wouldn't really recommend using like the super uber duper mega clay based stuff, because as that's going to get wet, it's going to dry and it's going to form like quite hard lumps, to which the skink isn't going to be able to penetrate and swim through. So really good substrates that we would recommend using would be something like the Lucky Reptile Nature Brown Bedding. You can use the Desert Life by ProRep. And as well, if you wanted to, you could also use Child's Play sand. Now, because these animals are quite small and they're from the desert, they're not going to go to the toilet that often, but you still need to make sure that you're going through the sand with like a nice little sieve just to eke out any poo or any other like shedded skin bits, any dead insects, that type of thing, just so you can be on top of your spot cleaning. So the more on top of your spot cleaning you are, the longer you're going to have with your substrate. Moving on to decor now. So what decor am I going to have in there? It's going to be fairly barren and sparse. Where they come from, there's not that much around. So what we've done with ours, we've added in some cacti. We've also popped in some like slate rocks, so it gives them like different levels, and also basking opportunities. So if they want to like get warmer, they can do. It's right directly under the bulb. Another good thing about using rocks in the substrate, and as well using rocks as a basking platform, is that the bulb is going to be beating down on that slate rock for a very long time, therefore heating that rock up. So on a night time, if you are a little bit panicky, obviously about the temperatures dropping too much, if that animal did feel cold, it could easily go onto the rock and warm itself up. Now, what kind of rocks to use? It's completely up to you. It's your enclosure. You can use whatever rocks you want, as long as they're sterilized. If you wanted to, you could also add in like the odd bit of branch in there as well, just to kind of like break up the monotony. You could also hide things as well inside the substrate, so you could add rocks deeper inside the substrate. So we'd always recommend having like a really nice thick layer in there, just so the animal can exhibit its natural behavior. If it does get too hot on the top, it can also go straight down and cool off. Mooching on over to feeding now. So I've kept Sand Fish Skinks before, and the ones that I had previously were absolute little terrors when it came to feeding. They were not shy really at all. So we used to feed them things like locusts and crickets and mealworms, literally anything that they can get their mouths around, they would eat. The ones we have, I haven't got any footage of them feeding because I think they're food shy. Literally, as soon as anybody starts looking at them, they're like, no, I'm not eating. They just like sit on the rocks, bask, do their own little skink things, and then just ignore. But their wild counterparts will eat things like small little beetles and other small insects. So an insectivorous based diet is what we would typically recommend in captivity. Now, make sure as well that you are supplementing every single piece of live food that goes into that enclosure. If you just want to use a broad spectrum supplement to start off with, that is absolutely fine. You can go ahead and do that. If you want to go for a little bit more of like an advanced supplementation regime, then I'd probably recommend going on Arcadia's website, popping the species in, and then finding out what's best going to suit you. Now, how big do these skinks get? So typically Sand Fish Skinks will get around about 20-ish centimeters. Sometimes they might get a little bit bigger, but only literally by a smidgen, and sometimes they might get a little bit smaller, but on average it's around about 20 centimeters. And in terms of lifespan, these guys can live to around about 10 to 12 years. Now, I would assume because of the advancements in technology that we now have, we could potentially get these animals to live a little bit longer. But at the minute, the average is around about 10 to 12. Now, I touched on it briefly about the cool little adaptations that they've got, obviously like with their fingers being splayed and being able to swim through the sand and stuff. But they're also very sensitive to vibration. So this is going to aid them when it comes to detecting prey or even predators. So any larger like animals that would like eat them, if they feel any vibrations, they can just scarper straight into that sand. And that about wraps us up for this care guide. So thank you very much for sticking around all the way through to the end, and hope you've got a decent glimpse into what it's like to care for these absolutely amazing species. If you're thinking about taking care of these, I would 100% recommend you do so. You will not regret it. And anyway, on that bombshell, I'll see you in the next one. Adios.